If you've ever been treated like you were part of the furniture, like a fixture that holds the door and nothing more, this story is going to mean something to you. So before we start, hit subscribe, because the man in this story stood at the same door for 12 years, while the people who walked past him had no idea who he was. And the day one of them tried to destroy him, the whole building discovered that the doorman knew every single one of their secrets and had been protecting every single one of them the entire time. His name was Joseph Okafor. And for 12 long years, he was the doorman at a building called the Ashford, one of those pre-war towers, on a good street in a great city, marble lobby, brass fittings and awning out front, the kind of address that people say out loud at parties so that other people will react to it. Joseph had held that door for 12 years. He knew every resident by name and more than their names. He knew their rhythms, their troubles, the shape of their days, because a doorman sees everything and says nothing. And Joseph had raised silence and observation to something close to an art. He was a big man, gentle with a voice that still carried the music of the country he was born in, and he wore the building's uniform, a long coat with brass buttons and a cap. And he wore it with a dignity that made some of the residents vaguely uncomfortable without their being able to say why. Because there is a certain kind of person who is unsettled by a man in a servant's uniform, who carries himself like he is nobody's servant, who is unfailingly kind and helpful, and also unmistakably entirely his own man. Joseph opened the door for them and hailed their cabs and signed for their packages and remembered that Mrs. Adler on 4 liked her. Mail brought up because of her hip, and that the Petersons on 9 were quietly divorcing and needed the doorman to be discreet about which of them was home, and that the young man on 11 had a drinking problem his family did not know about, and sometimes needed help to the elevator without anyone seeing, and Joseph carried all of it. Hundreds of small secrets, the whole hidden life of a building, and he carried it the way he carried everything, without comment, without judgment, and without ever once being thanked for the carrying, because most of the residents did not know he was carrying anything at all. He kept a small notebook. Joseph did not of secrets exactly, but of the things a good doorman needs to hold: the birthdays and the allergies and the fears. The fact that the little girl on 7 was terrified of the man in the mailroom and needed Joseph to walk her past the fact that the widower on 12 had no one, and so Joseph made a point of asking him one real question every single day: how are you? Which is a door people close, but a specific question: did your team win? How is that book? A question that required a real answer, because Joseph understood that for some of the people in that building, he was the only person all day who would ask them anything at all and wait for the answer. He never thought of this as kindness. He thought of it as the job, the real job, the keeping the thing beneath the door. To most of them, he was the door. He was the thing that opened. What none of them knew, what Joseph did not advertise, was who he had been before the door. In Lagos, before he came to this country, Joseph Okafor had been a structural engineer, not a small one. He had worked on real buildings, towers taller than the Ashford, had a degree and a license, and the respect of his profession had been in the ark. His life was supposed to follow a man other men called Sir. And then he had come to this country the way people come, full of a plan and a belief in the fairness of things, and he had learned what a great many educated immigrants learn, which is that a foreign license is a piece of paper. The new country does not choose to read that his years of expertise translated on this side of the ocean into exactly nothing, that any employer was required to honor, that to practice again he would need to redo years of schooling and testing he could not afford while also eating, and that in the meantime the bills did not care that he had designed towers, the bills only cared that they be paid. So Joseph had taken the work that would have him, and he had done it with his whole heart, because his father in Lagos had taught him a thing that Joseph believed all the way to his bones, that there is no such thing as a small job. There are only small ways of doing a job, and that a man's dignity is not conferred by his title. It is generated by how completely he does whatever is in front of him. Joseph's father back in Lagos had been a carpenter, a maker of doors, in fact, which Joseph thought about often as he stood holding one, and his father used to say a thing over the workbench that shaped Joseph's entire life. He would say, "A door is the most honest thing a man can make because it does only one job. It decides who comes in and who stays out, and it must do that job perfectly every single time, or it is not a door, it is a hole with wood around it." And he taught young Joseph to plane a door until it swung silent and true, to take a full day on a thing people would walk through in a second and never notice, because he said, "The people who walk through will never know how good the door is. You will know. Do it for the knowing." Joseph carried that into engineering the reverence for the thing done completely, whether or not anyone noticed, and it was why his towers in Lagos stood true, and it was why when the new country took his license and handed him a literal door to hold. Joseph did not experience it as the humiliation others assumed it must be, because his father had taught him that there was no such thing as a small door. Only small ways of holding one, and Joseph held that door at the Ashford, the way his father had planned doors in Lagos, completely for the knowing whether anyone noticed or not. And for 12 years, almost no one noticed, and Joseph did it perfectly anyway, every single time, because that was the whole of the man. And then there were the twins. Joseph's wife Ngozi had died 4 years before this story, when the twins Chidi and Amaka were 6. It had been sudden, a car, a wet road, the kind of loss that arrives with no warning and no reason and rearranges the universe in an instant. And Joseph had found himself at once a widower and a single father of 2 small children in a country where he had no family, no village, none of the vast network of aunties and cousins that would have caught a grieving family back home. And it was in the weeks after Ngozi died, weeks in which Joseph could barely stand up under the weight of it, that he made a decision that a certain kind of person would call a failure of ambition, and that Joseph knew to be the truest wisdom of his life. He had, before Ngozi died, been on the verge of finally going back into school, of clawing his way back toward the engineering license, of reclaiming the Sir, and he let it go. He looked at his 2 motherless 6-year-olds, and he looked at the years of night classes and study that reclaiming his old life would cost years. He would have to steal from his children in the exact season they had just lost their mother and needed their father most, and he decided clear-eyed that he would rather be a present doorman than an absent engineer. That his children did not need a father with a better title. They needed a father who was there, who was at the door when they came home from school, who could take the shifts that let him make their breakfast and be at their recitals, and that the dignity his own father had taught him did not live in a license. It lived in the completeness with which you loved the people in front of you. So Joseph stayed at the door. And he never once told the residents of the Ashford that the man hailing their cabs had designed towers, because it was none of their business, and because he had decided long ago that he would not spend his life auditioning for the respect of people who had already decided not to give it. The first year after Ngozi was the hardest thing Joseph had ever done, harder than emigrating, harder than losing the license, and he did it almost entirely alone, and the residents of the Ashford never knew, because Joseph came to that door every single day of that first year, with his grief folded up under the coat with the brass buttons, and his voice steady and his smile real, because the twins were watching him at home, and the building was depending on him at work. And Joseph had decided that his sorrow was his to carry and not a thing to set down on other people. He would hold the door and hail the cabs and remember the mail for Mrs. Adler's hip, and then he would go home and lie on the floor of the twins' room until they fell asleep, because Amaka could not sleep unless she could hear him breathing, and then he would sit at the kitchen table and let himself for 1 hour in the dark. Miss his wife, the way a man misses half of himself, and then he would sleep 3 hours and get up and make breakfast and put on the coat and do it all again. He learned to braid Amaka's hair off a video badly at first, and then well, because it had been Ngozi's task, and now it was his, and he learned every one of Chidi's fears and Amaka's silences, and slowly over that first terrible year, he built out of nothing a home that held a 2-parent amount of love delivered by one exhausted man in a doorman's coat. And the twins grew up steady and kind and sure of themselves, and that not the towers in Lagos is the thing Joseph is proudest of building in his life, and no license is required to build it, and no country can refuse to read it. The twins knew, though. Joseph made sure the twins knew exactly who their father was and exactly why he stood at that door, because he was not going to let his children grow up ashamed of the coat with the brass buttons. He told them the truth, all of it, the towers in Lagos, the license the new country would not read, and the choice most of all. He told Chidi and Amaka, "Some people will look at your father in this coat, and they will decide he is a small man. Let them. You will know the truth. Your father can build towers. Your father chose to build you. That is not a smaller thing. That is the larger thing. Never let anyone make you believe the coat is the man." And the twins, 10 years old, now believed him mostly the way children believe things, until the day came that tested whether they really did, the day a man named Blake Crandall moved into the penthouse. Blake Crandall was new money, and I do not say that as an insult to new money. Plenty of new money is lovely. I say it because Crandall wore his the specific way that certain insecure men do, as a weapon, as a scorecard, as a thing to hit people with. I had made a fortune fast in something to do with finance, and he had bought the penthouse at the Ashford, and from his first day he treated the staff not as people, but as a mirror in which to admire his own importance, and he treated Joseph, in particular, with a contempt that Joseph recognized immediately, because it was the contempt of a man who needed there to be someone beneath him in order to feel like he was above anything. Crandall snapped his fingers at Joseph. Crandall called him, "Hey guy." Never his name, though. His name was on a brass tag on his coat. Crandall complained about him to management for imagined slights, for being too slow with the door, for looking at him wrong, the petty accumulating cruelties of a small man, testing how much he could get away with. And Joseph absorbed all of it, the way he absorbed everything, with a steadiness that only enraged Crandall further, because a bully needs his target to flinch, and Joseph Okafor did not flinch. There was one afternoon in particular that Joseph never told the twins about, but that Chidi happened to witness because he had come to the building after school to wait for his father's shift to end. Crandall came through the lobby with two of his associates laughing loud, and he saw Joseph holding the door, and he decided to perform for his friends the way small men do. And he stopped and he looked Joseph up and down, and he said to his associates, but loud enough for the whole lobby, "You know what I love about this building? Even the help looks distinguished. Look at this guy. Probably thinks he's somebody." And he laughed, and his associates laughed uncomfortably, and Joseph held the door and said, "After you, Mr. Crandall," in a voice with not one drop of anything in it, perfectly level, perfectly kind, and Crandall went through, and Chidi, 12 feet away. 10 years old, watched a man mock his father to his face, and watched his father refuse to give the man the reaction he was fishing for. And Chidi's hands were shaking with a rage he did not know what to do with. And afterward, when the lobby was empty, Joseph came and sat with his son, and Chidi burst out, "Why do you let him talk to you like that? Why don't you say something?" And Joseph said, "Say what, my son? That I am somebody. A man who has to announce he is somebody is telling you he is afraid he is not. That man just told the whole lobby he is afraid, and he does not even know it. I do not have to say I am somebody. I know it. You know it. Your sister knows it. Your mother knew it. That is enough, people. I do not need it from him. And here is the thing you must understand, Chidi, because it is the hardest thing I know. He wanted me to be angry. My anger was the thing he came to collect. When I do not give it, he leaves with nothing, and I keep everything. That is not weakness. That is the strongest thing a man can do. Do not confuse the two ever, no matter what the world tells you." Chidi did not fully understand it that day. He understood it completely a few weeks later when the watch went missing, and he watched the same lesson play out on a scale that nearly destroyed them. And then Blake Crandall's watch went missing. It was an expensive watch. Genuinely expensive, the kind that cost more than Joseph made in 2 years. And Crandall discovered it missing after a party he had thrown in the penthouse, a party with 60 guests and caterers and a coat check and a great deal of alcohol. And Blake Crandall, faced with the loss of his watch, did not think about the 60 guests or the caterers or the coat check. He thought about the doorman. Because in the story, Blake Crandall told himself about the world. The story where he was above and others were beneath. The answer to a missing valuable was obvious and required no investigation. It was the big black immigrant in the servant's coat. It had to be. And Crandall went to building management, and he did not say, "I would like to file a police report." He said, "Your doorman stole my watch, and either you fire him today or I will make your lives and this building's reputation a living hell." And he had the money and the penthouse and the lawyer to make that threat real. And management, faced with a choice between a wealthy resident and a doorman, did the thing that institutions do, the thing you already know they did. They suspended Joseph pending investigation, without pay. On the word of a man who had lost his watch at his own party and decided without a shred of evidence that the thief was the one person in the building who had spent 12 years never taking so much as a mint from the front desk candy dish. Joseph went home that day and had to tell his 10-year-old twins that he had been sent home from the door accused of stealing. And this was the moment, this exact moment, when everything he had taught them about the coat and the man was going to be tested, because a child can believe that a title does not define a father. right up until the world tells that child their father is a thief. And then the belief has to survive contact with the cruelty of the actual world. Chidi the boy got angry, wanted to fight, wanted to know who this man was, wanted to make it right with the 10-year-old's faith that wrongs can be made right. If you are only angry enough. But it was Amaka the girl, quiet like her father, who asked the question that mattered, who looked at Joseph and said, "Daddy, did they even look? Did anyone even look for who really took it? Or did they just decide it was you?" And Joseph, who had spent 12 years watching how buildings and institutions actually work, had to tell his daughter the truth, which was no, they had not looked, they had simply decided, because deciding was cheaper than looking, and looking might have cost them a wealthy resident, and a doorman was in the arithmetic of the Ashford the cheapest thing to spend. The days of the suspension were their own quiet ordeal, and they tested Joseph in a place deeper than pride, because a man suspended without pay, who has 2 children to feed, cannot afford the luxury of dignity for very long. And Joseph sat at the kitchen table those nights and did the math. The same math every one of these people does. And the math said they had a cushion of a few weeks. And then it said nothing good, and Joseph felt for the first time in the 12 years the cold breath of the thing he had held off for so long, the possibility that his choice, the doorman over the engineer, the present father over the reclaimed title, might have left his family with no floor to stand on if the door itself was taken away. He did not let the twins see that fear. I made their breakfast and helped with their homework and told them it would be resolved, and at night alone he allowed himself to be afraid, and then he folded the fear up under where the coat used to hang, and he kept going, because that was the only thing his father and his losses had ever taught him how to do. And what he did not know sitting at that table doing the frightened math was that a building full of people he had quietly served was at that very moment beginning to move on his behalf, that the deposits were about to be paid back. That a man who spends 12 years holding other people's lives is never as alone as he feels at the kitchen table in the dark, even when he cannot yet see the hands reaching toward him. And Amaka said, "Then we have to make them look." Here is the thing about Joseph Okafor, that Blake Crandall in his contempt had never bothered to learn the thing that was about to turn the whole situation on its head. Joseph did not need to prove he was innocent. Joseph could prove who was guilty, because Joseph was the doorman, and the doorman sees everything, and the doorman remembers everything. And the doorman at the Ashford was also the man who reviewed the lobby and service entrance security footage. Every single shift as part of a job he did more completely than anyone had ever asked him to. Joseph had not stolen the watch. But Joseph knew, because he paid attention, because paying attention was the whole of his craft, exactly who had been in the building that night and when, and he had a very good idea. An idea he had kept to himself out of the discretion that was bone deep in him, about a certain guest who had left Crandall's party alone at an odd hour, moving in the particular way that Joseph had learned over 12 years meant a person was leaving with something they should not have. But Joseph suspended was no longer allowed in the building. He could not access the footage. And management protecting Crandall had no interest in reviewing it, because reviewing it might complicate the cheap and easy story they had already chosen. So the truth existed sat there on a hard drive in a room Joseph was no longer permitted to enter, and the gap between the truth existing and the truth being seen was once again exactly the gap where a good man gets destroyed. And this is where the 12 years came back to him all at once, in a way that Joseph never saw coming, because Joseph had spent 12 years making deposits he never once thought of as deposits. It started with Mrs. Adler on 4, the one with the hip, the one whose mail Joseph brought up. When she came down to the lobby and found a stranger at the door and asked where Joseph was and heard the answer, she did not accept it. Miss Adler was 86 years old and had buried 2 husbands and was afraid of nothing, and she remembered out loud to anyone who would listen that Joseph Okafor had once spent his own money to buy her a proper cane when he noticed the building issued one was hurting her wrist and had never mentioned it, and had let her believe the building provided it, and that a man who does that does not steal watches. And Mrs. Adler started making calls because a woman who has lived 86 years in a building like that knows everyone, and she was not going to let them do this to Joseph. There was a doctor on the 6th floor, a woman named Farah, who came forward with a story none of the others knew. The 2 winters earlier, her elderly mother visiting from out of state and in the early confusion of a dementia. None of them had named yet had wandered out of the building at 4 in the morning in her nightgown into the cold, and that it was Joseph, ending his shift, who had noticed who had gone after her, who had walked the freezing streets for 40 minutes until he found her and had wrapped her in his own coat. The coat with the brass buttons, and walked her home, talking to her gently in the voice he used with his own children, and had never mentioned it, had never asked for thanks, had simply logged that he was leaving late and gone home to his twins. Farah found out only because her mother, in a lucid hour weeks later, kept talking about the kind man in the beautiful coat who found me in the dark. And Farah stood in the management office, and she said, her voice shaking, "That man walked the streets at 4 in the morning for 40 minutes to save my mother's life, and wrapped her in his own coat and never told a soul. And you are going to fire him for stealing a watch on the word of a man who lost it at his own party. You review that footage today, or I will spend every dollar I have making sure this city knows what the Ashford did to Joseph Okafor." And it turned out Mrs. Adler was not alone, because it turned out that Joseph, over 12 years, had touched nearly every life in that building, in some quiet way he had never mentioned to anyone, and now, one by one, those lives came forward. The Petersons on 9, the ones who were divorcing, remembered how Joseph had handled their terrible year with a discretion and a gentleness that had spared their children a great deal of pain. How he had never once made either of them feel judged. The young man on 11, the one with the drinking problem, was sober, now 2 years sober, and he told anyone who would listen that the reason he was alive was that a doorman had gotten him to the elevator with his dignity intact enough times that he had eventually found the strength to get help, and had done it without ever once shaming him. Family after family, secret after secret, all of it, kept all of it now surfacing. Not the secrets themselves, but the fact of a man who had held them, and the residents of the Ashford discovered collectively, in a way they never had while it was happening, that the man they had treated as the thing that opens the door had been all along the quiet keeper of the entire building's humanity, and that they owed him a debt none of them had known they were accruing. They organized Miss Adler and the Petersons and the sober young man and a dozen others, and they went to management not as individuals who could be dismissed, but as a body, and they demanded the one thing that would settle it. They demanded that the footage be reviewed publicly with a witness, and they made it clear that if the Ashford fired a beloved 12-year employee on the unsupported word of a resident who had lost his own watch at his own party, they would not be quiet about it, that between the wealthy new man in the penthouse and the doorman who had held their building's soul for 12 years, they knew exactly which one they would defend, and it was not the one with the money. And a building full of residents is a thing even management cannot ignore, because a building full of residents is the actual value of the building, and so reluctantly cornered management reviewed the footage. And the footage showed exactly what Joseph had known it would show. It showed one of Crandall's own party guests, a business associate of his, in fact, leaving the building at 3 in the morning, alone, slipping something into his coat pocket in the elevator, moving in the exact furtive way that Joseph had clocked from across the lobby and filed away and said nothing about, because saying something was not his to do, while he still had the discretion of the job. The watch had not been stolen by the doorman, who had never taken a thing in 12 years. It had been stolen by a member of Crandall's own circle, a man Crandall had invited into his home, a man from Crandall's own world, and the cheap, easy story that Blake Crandall had reached for the instant his watch went missing, the story that put the crime on the immigrant in the servant's coat, turned out to be exactly backwards. The theft had come from above, not below, from Crandall's own kind, and Crandall had been so blinded by his need to have someone beneath him that he had accused the one honest man in the building, while the actual thief walked out the front door that Joseph held. The footage review itself was a small, terrible drama that a handful of residents insisted on witnessing, and Joseph was permitted back into the building for it, and he sat in the little security room where he had reviewed footage 1,000 times as part of a job he did more completely than anyone asked, and he watched the manager scrub through the night of the party, and Joseph did not gloat and did not point. He simply said quietly, 3:02 in the morning, service elevator, watch the gentleman's right hand as the doors close. And there it was, exactly where the man who paid attention had known it would be, and the room went silent, and the manager who had suspended Joseph could not look at him, and Mrs. Adler, who had insisted on being present, said to no one and to everyone, "That is what happens when you decide instead of look. You get it exactly backwards, and you nearly destroy the best man in the building." And Joseph said nothing, because there was nothing to say, because he had known the truth all along, and the only thing that had ever been in question was whether anyone would bother to look. And now they had, and being right gave him no pleasure. It only made him tired. The specific tiredness of a man who has spent his whole life knowing that the truth is almost never the problem. The looking is the problem. Joseph was reinstated, of course, with back pay, with an apology from management that was mostly lawyers protecting the building an apology. Joseph accepted with a nod and did not otherwise dignify because he understood exactly what it was and was not understood that the same institution apologizing to him now would suspend him again tomorrow if the arithmetic favored it, and that the only real protection he had ever had, it turned out, was not the management or the contract or the law. It was the 12 years of quiet, keeping the deposits, the notebook, the widower's daily question, the doctor's mother wrapped in his coat, all of it. The invisible account that no institution could see and no institution could touch. And Blake Crandall was left exposed as exactly what he was, a small man who had tried to destroy a good one to avoid the discomfort of looking at his own world and the residents made. The Ashford so cold for Crandall that he sold the penthouse within the year, which is the closest thing to justice that a building can deliver. But the reinstatement and Crandall's exit are not the point of the story any more than the money was the point of any of these stories, because the point of this one happened in the lobby on the day Joseph came back to the door. Because when Joseph Okafor returned to the Ashford in his coat with the brass buttons, the residents did a thing that had never once happened in 12 years. They were waiting for him. Mrs. Adler and the Petersons and the sober young man and dozens of others gathered in the marble lobby, and when Joseph walked in, they applauded this quiet, dignified man who had held their door and their secrets, and they applauded not the door, but the man. Finally, at last the man, and Joseph stood in the lobby of a building he had served for 12 years, and was for the first time seen, fully seen by the people who had walked past him for over a decade without knowing what walked past them. And his twins were there. Chidi and Amaka, 10 years old, watching a lobby full of wealthy strangers applaud their father, the doorman, the man in the coat, the man Blake Crandall had called, "Hey guy." And Amaka looked up at Joseph and did not have to say anything, because the thing her father had told her, the thing that had been tested to its breaking point, the thing about the coat and the man had just been proven true in front of 100 witnesses, and she would carry the proof of it for the rest of her life. Joseph gave a small speech because they asked him to, and it was not the speech anyone expected. He did not talk about the injustice or Crandall or the watch. He said, "Thank you. I have stood at this door for 12 years, and I have known all of you, and I have kept what I knew because that is the job. The door is not the job, the keeping is the job. And I want to say one thing to my children who are here so that they hear me say it in front of you." And he turned to Chidi and Amaka, and he said, "I told you that some people would look at your father in this coat and decide he was a small man. And some did. But look at these people. This is what a man is worth, and it is not measured in the title on his coat. It is measured in how completely he loved the people in front of him. And I have loved every person in this lobby quietly for 12 years. And today they are loving me back. And that my children, that is the only fortune a man ever really builds. Not the towers, the people. Never forget who your father is." And there was not a dry eye in that marble lobby, and Mrs. Adler, 86, cried openly, and the twins went to their father and held onto his coat with the brass buttons. And the coat, in that moment, was not a servant's coat at all. It was the robe of the most respected man in the building, because respect, real respect, is not given by the people above you. It is generated by the people whose lives you have quietly held, and Joseph Okafor had been generating it, one held secret and one kept dignity at a time for 12 years. Joseph stayed at that door for many more years by choice, always by choice, and he watched his twins grow up, present for every recital and every heartbreak and every triumph, exactly as he had chosen, and both of them, Chidi and Amaka, will tell you now that the single most important lesson of their lives was delivered in a marble lobby by a man in a coat with brass buttons. The lesson that the world will constantly try to tell you that your worth is your title, and that the world is wrong, and that the proof of how wrong it is will show up eventually in the faces of the people you chose to love completely, while everyone else was busy climbing. Blake Crandall, for what it is worth, tried once to apologize near the end before he sold the penthouse, and it was not much of an apology. It was the apology of a man who was mostly sorry he had been caught being what he was. He came to the door and he said something about a misunderstanding, about being under stress, about not meaning anything by it. And Joseph listened, and then Joseph did the thing that was in its way, the final and largest demonstration of everything he was. He said, "Mr. Crandall, I forgive you. I want you to hear that because it is true, but I'm going to tell you why I forgive you, and it is not for your sake. I forgive you because carrying anger toward you would mean giving you a room in my mind rent-free for the rest of my life, and I have decided that you do not get to live there. You have taken enough of my weeks. You will not have my years. So I forgive you, and I wish you well, and I mean it, and now I'm going to hold this door for you one last time, completely, the way I hold it for everyone, because that is who I am, and it was never once about who you are." And he held the door, and Crandall went through it smaller than he had ever been. And Joseph felt nothing but the clean lightness of a man who owes no one any anger, and that the twins will tell you was the most powerful thing they ever saw their father do, more than being vindicated, more than the applause in the lobby. The sight of a man handing back a cruelty with a blessing on it, and keeping his whole soul in the exchange. Chidi became a civil engineer, and he will tell you without hesitation that he chose it because his father designed towers and was not allowed to build them here, and that he is building the towers his father was not permitted to build, and that every one of them is in a way he has never told his father because it would make the old man cry a love letter to the man at the door. And Amaka became a labor lawyer, and she fights specifically and by choice for immigrants whose credentials this country will not read for the engineers, driving cabs and the doctors cleaning offices and the architects holding doors because she grew up watching the finest man she ever knew be treated as furniture by people who did not deserve to hold his coat. And she decided to spend her life making the country read the paper it refused to read for her father. So here's what I want you to take from Joseph Okafor and the door he held for 12 years. There are people all around you right now whose worth you cannot see because they are wearing the coat of a job you have decided is beneath your attention, the person who brings your food and the person who cleans your building and the person who holds your door, and some of them design towers, and some of them are keeping secrets that hold whole lives together. And all of them are doing exactly what Joseph's father taught him, generating a dignity that has nothing to do with the title and everything to do with the completeness of the doing. Learn their names. The name is on the tag. It cost you nothing to read it, and it might be as it was at the Ashford, the name of the most valuable person in the building. And there is one more thing. The hardest thing, the thing Joseph modeled that most of us find nearly impossible. When you are the one being treated as furniture, when someone snaps their fingers at you or waves a hand at your whole existence and asks for someone better, remember what Joseph told his son in the empty lobby. The anger they are fishing for is the only thing they can actually take from you, and only if you hand it over. Your worth does not require their recognition to be real, any more than a well-made door requires the person walking through it to admire the joinery. You know, the people who love you know. That is enough, people. Keep your years for yourself. Do not rent them out to small men. Joseph held that door for 12 years for the knowing, and in the end the whole building came to know, but even if they never had the door would still have been true, and so would the man. Because the truth of a thing does not wait for an audience to become true. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments the name of someone in your life who holds a door, literal or otherwise, someone whose worth the world refuses to see, and say the name out loud in the comment, because names matter and Joseph would want us saying them. And subscribe because this channel is in the business of the people the world treats as furniture, and the day the world finds out it was wrong. And tomorrow when someone holds a door for you or brings your food or cleans the space you move through without noticing, look into the eye and read the name on the tag and say it back to them. Watch what it does to their face. You may be the first person all day to treat them like the person they actually are. That is a small thing that costs nothing, and it is also, as Joseph would tell you, very nearly the whole of what we are here to do for one another. There's another one standing quietly at the door waiting to be seen. Come, let them in.